Tonight, I would like to officially inaugurate my new series reading George W. Bush's A Charge to Keep. This is a series that I promised a little while ago, and I feel that I can't avoid it any longer. Tonight, we're going to be looking at one of the chapters of this campaign manifesto. I will read through the entirety of the chapter to give you the full context, and I will offer my comments as necessary. Hopefully it will be fairly clear when I am commenting and when I am reading. On the left is the copy of the book that I have. That is the original version of the book that was released during 2000. He later made a re-release that added the subtitle My Journey to the White House, and he changed up the picture to show that the job had aged him. Therefore, he is a serious person to be respected and admired. Anyway, let's get into this text. Let's see, is there anything else we need to say? Oh, he had a co-writer, Karen Hughes, and there's a possibility, because she was a co-writer, that some of the thoughts in the book are actually hers and not Bush's. But I think that for the most part of all of the political books I've ever seen, this one most accurately reflects the personality of its author. So we'll see if you agree as we go along. The world as we had known it changed dramatically, but not until the spring of my senior year at Yale. The sit-ins and long hair and sometimes violent protests that came to symbolize the unrest on the college campuses of the late 1960s and early 1970s were just beginning, but they had not yet arrived on our campus as my friends and I prepared to graduate. So there are a couple things here that need to be said. First of all, one of the things that you could consider a written Bushism is that Bush will never hesitate to tell you about how many friends he has. If someone in his book is a friend, he will talk about that friend as a friend and talk about their friendship. You just got to know this guy has a lot of friends, and that's important, and that means that you should be his friend too, and you should trust him because other people are friends with him. I assume that's what he's getting at with all of this, but it comes up over and over and over every single chapter of the book. There's also a little bit of an attempt here to distance himself from the radical student culture of the late 60s by saying, look, this shit was only happening when I was a senior, I had other things going on, nothing to do with it. As if anyone really thought that Bush was any kind of radical. We later joked that members of the class of 1968 were the last in a long time to have short hair. That's a kind of conservative virtue signaling from this period. Boomer ideals and boomer debates still dominated completely in the year 2000, and basically for conservative boomers, they prided themselves on not having been long-haired hippies, and some of the more liberal boomers still looked with fondness on their hippie past. The atmosphere at Yale for most of my first 3.5 years was traditional. Oh, so he's upping the timeline. It's only that last semester when the crazies came out. College was a time of hard work during the week and parties on the weekend. The discipline and study habits I had developed in boarding school at Andover stood me in good stead as I went from its rigid structure and rules to the free-form world of college. I bet that all of his parties were strictly confined to the weekends. There's no way that Bush fucked around. Also, his GPA was revealed later, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was not impressive. I think he had, like a 2.2 GPA or something like that. So he wasn't studying very hard, regardless of what he says here. He was not a good student. This is just pure myth-making. I took my classes seriously and worked hard. I was enthralled by history, which became my major, with emphasis on American and European history. And I made friends and played hard. Again with the friends. Also, I find it depressing that George W. Bush had the same major that I did. The students at Yale came from all different backgrounds in all parts of the country. And all of them were rich as fuck. Within months, I knew many of them. That's the third time he's talked about having friends. This is just the first page. This is a half page because half the page is filled with the title of the chapter. So we're up to 3 on the friend references. After our freshman year, Yale students were assigned to residential colleges, which were spread all over the campus. Fraternities provided a common gathering place, and my four classmates, Clay and Terry Johnson, Rob Dieter, and Ted Livingston, and I all joined Delta Kappa Epsilon DKE. I spent much of my spare time with my fraternity brothers. They became lifelong friends. 4. One now works with me in the governor's office, others have been business partners, and many are helping in my presidential campaign. Our Delta Kappa Epsilon parties were known as some of the best on campus. We would hire bands and host big dances. My senior year, I joined Skull and Bones, a secret society. So secret, I can't say anything more. It was a chance to make 14 new friends. 5. Also, this reference to Skull and Bones, I think he did not only to name drop and sort of advertise his importance with elite people. What this did, though, is give ammunition to people like Alex Jones, who thinks that any kind of secret society must be nefarious. It's probably just a bunch of college kids doing shots and mumbling weird shit. There's not really much to it. It's just networking for rich people and play acting. But, you know, for someone like Alex Jones, this is a nefarious passage, and I'm sure that this got cited in all of his work on exposing the Bilderbergs or whatever that was called that he did back in the mid-2000s. I love sports. Baseball was my favorite, but my talent never matched my enthusiasm. I was a mediocre pitcher on the Yale baseball team. In my junior year, I was introduced to rugby, and I worked my way onto the first team for my senior year. Rugby is a great game, a game of speed and hard knocks with the tradition of post-game camaraderie. So, one thing I do notice about Bush's writing is that the sentences tend to be short and choppy. They're very declarative, and there's not a lot of what you would call complex grammar going on. And while that could be partly a political choice to keep things really simple and easy, it also could be the case that the simplicity of his sentence structure shows the simplicity of his thought, which I think in this case, at least with him, is pretty clear. When I wasn't playing, I was an enthusiastic and spirited supporter of Yale's teams. I vividly remember our elation when the Fighting Yale Bulldogs, led by Calvin Hill and Brian Dowling, upset Princeton to win the Ivy League football championship in my senior year. We charged onto the field to take the goalpost. Unfortunately, I was sitting on the crossbar when campus security arrived. The police were not nearly as impressed with our victory as we were. We were escorted off the field and told to leave town. I have not been back since. Ha 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 ha. In another not-so-proud moment that I later described as the infamous Christmas wreath caper, some friends, 6, and I decided to liberate a Christmas wreath from a local hotel to dress up the DKE house for an upcoming party. We were apprehended for disorderly conduct. We apologized and the charges were dropped. So, needless to say, this is a rich kid committing a low-level crime and being slapped on the wrist because he seemed nice enough and respectable. He had a famous last name, and he was at a good school. Wealth clearly has its benefits. I did not date a lot in college because I was dating a wonderful woman in Houston. I asked Kathy to marry me over Christmas of my junior year, but we later postponed the wedding and gradually drifted apart. I still think the world of her, and our parting was friendly. We were young, we lived in different places, and we gradually developed different lives. The next year brought big changes. The events of 1968 rocked our previously placid world and shocked the country, Yale, and me. In many ways, that spring was the end of an era of innocence. The gravity of history was beginning to descend in a horrifying and disruptive way. So, what he's done here is setting up 1968 to show that he thought that the events were somewhat horrifying and that he sees it mostly as a disruption of order. That is a very conservative virtue signaling point of view. The idea being that things were going fine, why did all these terrible people have to come out of the woodwork and upset the way things should be? So it is setting up this kind of conflict between, the good people who were orderly and traditional versus the dirty hippies. It's fairly Nixonian, just a little bit more refined. By the time the ball dropped in Times Square to welcome 1968, the situation in Vietnam had escalated from a conflict to a raging war. It had already been a raging war before 1968. I mean, really? Was it the Ia Drang campaign? Ia Drang, however you say that? Wasn't that in 1965? That was a pretty major campaign. I mean, okay. So clearly Bush, despite being a history major and a contemporary of the events, doesn't know a hell of a lot. Every night the newscast included a body count. On January 31st, the North Vietnamese Tet Offensive began. In March, President Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. In early April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on a hotel balcony in Memphis. I was shocked by the Reverend King's assassination and stunned by the violence. I watched, appalled, as racial riots escalated across the country. Militant groups such as the Black Panthers argued that the Reverend King's assassination also put to death the notion that civil rights could be achieved in a nonviolent way. I disagreed and hoped America could remedy civil wrongs in a peaceful way. So effectively, by only mentioning the Black Panthers as a militant group, he is shifting the blame for the disruptions and violence of the period onto the left, and especially onto a group of people on the left who were black. This is a clear case of 90s style Republican dog whistling. He's not directly saying anything racist, but the implication is there if you're looking for it. This is actually clever rhetoric. This was not just accidental, off-the-cuff speech about a man's past. This was very clearly constructed rhetoric to achieve an effect with an audience of mostly conservative voters. Television brought vividly to life the discrimination that existed in many parts of America. I was horrified as I watched the snarling dogs and billy clubs directed at America's own citizens. It was hard for me to imagine a society that would treat my friends, 7, as harshly and unjustly as what I saw on television. Your friends were rich and white. Of course they're not going to get their asses beat by the cops. Their dad's on the police departments. I mean, are you fucking serious? I was the president of our fraternity. So he's popular. Once again, he has friends. People like him. Do you know that? People like George W. Bush? They do. He has friends. The vice president, Paul Jones, was an African American. So were my good friends Calvin Hill and Roy Austin. Ours was a easy, natural friendship. I'm just going to stop counting the references to friends and friendship. It's undoable. I was reared by parents who taught me to respect others. I had been taught, and I believed, that all people are equal, that we are children of a loving God who cares about the quality of our hearts, not the color of our skins. Also, he used the black friends argument. I forgot to point that out, but yeah. Although the way he did it was less shitty than it normally is done, to be fair. I was surprised by the depth of the racial hatred I saw on television. Although I came from the South, that was never the attitude at my house. As a very young boy, I had once repeated a racial slur that I heard at school. My mother washed my mouth with soap and delivered such a stern lecture that I knew immediately I had done something very wrong. I remember my dad teaching us that each individual mattered and that each individual had a shot at the American dream. The spring of my senior year in 1968, Dad voted for the Fair Housing Act in Congress, a vote that outraged many of his Houston constituents. I was proud of him for standing his ground and bucking the temptation to succumb to popular opinion. His vote reflected his belief that housing and the opportunity for a better life should be open to all in America. By the way, speaking of Bush 41, at various times in his career, he ran as a liberal, moderate, and conservative Republican, just depending on what district he was in or the mood of the country. H.W. Bush had no ideology, so the idea here that he had to vote his conscience, even if it was not something that he wanted to do, which is implied when we talk about his dad had the courage to stand against popular opinion. H.W. had no ideology in any meaningful sense, so there was never a time where his actions came into conflict with his ideology. As the year went on, the violence escalated. Anti-war protests that started out as peaceful sit-ins became clashes with police. Again, the wording heavily shifts the blame onto the anti-war protesters, while completely absolving the police and the pro-war protesters, who, by the way, were a real thing. Classes were finished, and we were counting the days to graduation when Robert Kennedy was assassinated the morning after winning the California primary. We were young men trying to enjoy what should have been the last carefree days of youth, but we could no longer be the same cavalier college students. We all knew that something was fundamentally, frighteningly wrong. So again, this is about Bush and his rich friends in Yale who were insulated, and now they're being made painfully aware that there are problems in the world, that the world that their daddies run is one that has some serious flaws and needs to be improved. Oh man, that's a stunning revelation. I feel like if you somehow managed to get out of college without figuring that out, that you failed to pay attention on any level. Either that or your school failed you horribly. So, I guess the only time Bush learned anything in college was during his last semester. It was a confusing and disturbing time. Suddenly, the President of the United States didn't want the job anymore. 2 of our national leaders had been assassinated. Far too many Americans seem to hate one another. The thing is, with Johnson not running for re-election, he figured he'd lose because of Vietnam. It seems like Bush is thinking that you can't just not run for re-election. As a politician, that's unthinkable to him. Dick Gregory, an African-American comedian and social activist, spoke at one of our graduation events. I'm surprised he didn't say a friend. He didn't just slip it in. He said that he wanted to open our eyes and give us an insight into being a Negro in America. Think about going to buy a pack of cigarettes, he said. You put your money in the machine, but nothing happens. You put more money in, and still nothing happens. You did what you were supposed to do, he said, but nothing happened. So you kick the machine, and you kick it again, but still nothing happens. It's frustrating as hell, he said. That cigarette machine owes you a pack of cigarettes, but it doesn't deliver. It was a different perspective, and it made a lasting impression. Someone finally figured out an analogy simple enough to penetrate George W. Bush's head. That must have been quite laborious. The other reality of the spring of 1968 was Vietnam. The war became increasingly personal as friends who had graduated the year before went into the military. The war was no longer something that was happening to other people in a distant land. It came home to us. We didn't have the luxury of looking for a job or taking time to consider what to do next. You just literally summed up everyone who's not a rich person, regardless of whether there's a war on or not. I mean, seriously, his whole take on Vietnam is this was traumatic for me because things were happening that I couldn't control, and I felt like I was going along with the country and not being completely insulated from the events around me. That is essentially his complaint here. It was hard to get a job until your military status was resolved. 3 months before I graduated, some Yale student body leaders signed an Ivy League Manifesto saying that they were seriously considering or have already decided to leave the country or go to jail rather than serve in Vietnam. Some speakers came to campus to talk about the war, but my friends and I did not attend the speeches. We discussed Vietnam, but we were more concerned with the decision each of us had to make, military service or not. I knew I would serve. Leaving the country to avoid the draft was not an option for me. I was too conservative and too traditional. In reality, he was just too well connected to have to serve. He could find a way to do some bullshit service that had no real meaning and would require him to face no real danger. As we'll see. My inclination was to support the government and the war until proven wrong, and that only came later, as I realized we could not explain the mission, had no exit strategy, and did not seem to be fighting to win. Wow, the irony there. The irony level is 9,000. I was well aware of my dad's service as a Navy fighter pilot in World War II. I had heard the stories and seen the pictures of his dramatic rescue after he was shot down over the Pacific Ocean. I remember opening up a scrapbook that Mother kept and seeing a small piece of a rubber raft glued into the book. It was part of the raft that had saved Dad's life, kept him afloat until he was rescued from the water. I like how he has to explain how a raft works, in case the reader was unaware of how rafts work and what function they serve. I'm sure the fact that my dad had been a fighter pilot influenced my thinking. I'm sure it did. I remember him telling me how much he loved to fly, how exhilarating the experience of piloting a plane was. I was heading for the military, and I wanted to learn a new skill that would make doing my duty an interesting adventure. I had never flown an airplane, but decided I wanted to become a pilot. Home in Houston for Christmas, I heard from contemporaries that there were openings for pilots in the Texas Air National Guard, and I called to ask about them. There were several openings, I was told, because many people who wanted to go into the Guard were unwilling to spend the almost 2 years of full-time duty required for pilot training. Bullshit. If you had to do mandatory years of military service, and you knew that you could spend 2 years training to be a pilot and therefore not on the front lines, and you have reservations about participating in this war, whether because you don't want to go to war personally or whether you disagree with the war, whatever the case might be, you're telling me that that would be a problem? No, that's not a problem. That's a bonus. Are you kidding me? If I felt like I wanted to not have to leave the country, but also I didn't really want to serve, and I had that opportunity, you're damn right I would take it, and exactly for the reason that there's a long period of training. Are you fucking serious here? I took my pilot aptitude test at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts in January 1968. That May, I went to Texas to interview with Colonel William Buck Stout, a Korean War veteran and highly acclaimed fighter group commander. I don't think there are all that many fighter group commanders who are truly famous. People who are famous in the military tend not to be famous outside of the military, at least unless they are people like Dave Petraeus or someone on that level. I met the qualifications and was accepted into the Texas Air National Guard. Shock. Yeah, your dad was there to pull the strings, and yeah, big shock you got accepted. After graduating in June, I started 6 weeks of basic training in July. Lackland Air Base in San Antonio in late July and August is hotter than hell and almost as unpleasant. Welcome to the land of slick heads and slick sleeves, I remember an instructor saying. They shaved your heads, making them slick, in quotes, and you had no rank, no standing, no stripe on your sleeve until you made it through basic training. My pilot training began in November at Moody Air Force Base in Valdosta, Georgia. I'll never forget one of the first flights with my new instructor, a tough, gruff Georgian. I was intimidated by him and by the airplane. I was even more frightened when he suddenly pulled the nose up and deliberately stalled the plane. "Are you afraid of this thing?" he asked as we began losing altitude. "Because if you're afraid of this airplane, you'll never be a pilot." He was graphically demonstrating that he was the master of the machine. The lesson was that I did not need to fear the airplane, I needed to learn to fly it. It didn't take long for me to be comfortable in the cockpit. Some people never were. Our class was much smaller at graduation than it was on the first day of flight school. I think what Bush is missing here is that his pilot was clearly aware that he was a Yale boy and someone from a rich family, and he was just fucking with him. That's clearly part of what was going on there. And apparently Bush didn't catch on. Also, I like how he had to make sure that he, let you know, not only was I a pilot, I was pretty good. You know, a lot of people just don't have the kind of confidence that I have with the plane. They, let the fear overtake them, but me, I conquered the fear. I stared the fear in the face because I'm a man. That's what Bush is trying to tell you. I enjoyed flying. Every day was a challenge, and I had a lot to learn. I learned the basics in the T-41, the Air Force equivalent of a Cessna 172. I then moved up to the T-37, a subsonic jet, where I learned to fly instruments. Finally, I advanced to the T-38, a high-powered airplane that was a joy to fly. I studied hard. Citation needed. When one of our instructors said he expected us to know the material, he meant backward and forward. I also learned the value of precision. I remember flying one day when the manual called for a 20-degree bank, a level glide path, and a 90-degree turn. I banked at 18, my nose slightly climbing, not level, and the degree of my turn was closer to 100 than 90. I'll never forget the instructor's harsh admonition. In the Air Force, when we say 20, we don't mean 18. And level is level, and anything else is sloppy. It's funny because a lot of people in the other branches of the military call the Air Force the chair force, and they say that it's by far the most civilian feeling of the branches, and most of the Air Force personnel are home by 5 o'clock. When my dad was stationed on an Air Force base, he was an Army officer, he was always home by 5. When we lived on Army bases, he would rarely be home before about 7. So I don't quite buy this, that this Air Force, the Air Force people were super strict and hard on him. I'm a little skeptical of that. The training was impressive. The need for precision and accuracy and exactness was drilled into us at every opportunity. We spent a lot of time responding to different situations, going through flight procedures time and time again. I spent 55 weeks on active duty, learning to fly, and graduated in December 1969. My dad pinned on my second lieutenant wings, a proud moment for both of us. He also, I guess because his dad was still, relatively well liked at around 2000, he also mentions any time he can his relationship with his father. Not as much as Meghan McCain, though. He never takes it to a Meghan McCain level. Maybe he set the template for talking about his dad, and then Meghan McCain saw that it kind of worked, and she decided to make that her whole career. That's just my personal theory. I was then assigned to Ellington Air Force Base in Houston, my home unit and also the home of the F-102 Flight Training School. There I would learn to fly the F-102A Delta Dagger Interceptor. Almost 57 feet long with a wingspan of about 36 feet, the F-102A is a single-seat, single-engine jet fighter, and putting it in the sky required single-minded focus and attention. So here's the thing. When I was a kid, I was really obsessed with military aircraft, and I learned all kinds of shit about them. And there's a problem with Bush signing up to fly the F-102. It was outdated by this period. The F-102 came out in the 50s. There was no way this thing would ever get anywhere near the front lines. Even if, say, the Russians sent a bunch of bombers to America, the F-102 would not be the front line of defense, despite being an interceptor. As an interceptor, this thing is not very maneuverable. It can't be used for dogfighting. And it had already been replaced by a more powerful aircraft called the F-106 Delta Dart, which was essentially the same design, but faster and better. So there's no chance that Bush's F-102 would have ever been sent into action. It was completely outdated, as I mentioned, and as an interceptor, you'd have to be in an area where you get attacked by air. Were the Viet Cong going to send a bomber group to America during the war, and Bush would have to defend Texas with his F-102? I just don't think so. So this was self-service. Let's keep it real. There was no chance of him ever having to see combat in this unit. One of my instructors was Mari Udell, a 270-pound black belt in judo who divided our training into academics and flight time. One week, we would study in the morning and fly in the afternoon. The next week, it was reversed. We studied engineering, flight characteristics, navigation, formation, equipment, emergency procedures and ejections, radar, missiles, and instrument procedures. Bush must feel really insecure about his credentials as an Air Force pilot because every time he gets a chance, he just lists every conceivable detail of the service. He was already being accused of not having really done Air National Guard service because there's very little evidence physically that he did. There's like one picture, I think. Anyway, I won't get into all that. I was not really into that controversy because that's more of a boomer controversy. Um, Worrying about who did what during the Vietnam era. I mean, I wasn't alive back then. I don't really care that much. But anyway, here we can see Bush trying to cover his tracks and make sure that people know I know how airplanes work, therefore I had to learn from the Air Force or Air National Guard. This is completely real and legitimate. Colonel Udell quizzed us every day and went over the same information time and time again. He required a blindfold position check on every position and instrument in the cockpit. When I once questioned the need for the long, repetitive briefings my instructor explained, it might be uncomfortable to listen to the same things over and over, but when you are on the final approach in bad weather, you'll be glad you remember what I'm teaching you. Also, it's funny that he complained about the long, repetitive briefings because later on, as president, Bush would always complain if someone's report was over 2 pages. So this was a trend throughout his life, apparently. Colonel Udell taught us to fly in visual flight conditions, instrument conditions, night or day, and in bad weather. We learned the radar system of acquisition of targets, how to best use it, how to be subtle or deceptive, the missile parameters, the flight envelope, the limits of the missiles, and the edge of the envelope for the airplane. There's no way he wrote that sentence. That was either Karen Hughes or some sort of military manual that they had access to. That just doesn't sound like a Bush sentence. Again, no chance. The goal was to learn to use the plane as you use your hand, instinctively, without having to think it through. We were taught to be precise. Colonel Udell used to say, "You don't miss, you don't use improper procedures. You plan your attack to be successful, and you execute it to be successful. Nothing else is acceptable. There is no fear in this dojo." After the study and training flights, I'll never forget my first solo flight in the F-102. I taxied out onto the runway, breathing through an oxygen mask with a parachute jammed into my back. I was strapped tightly into the cockpit. I remember a tremendous rush of adrenaline and anticipation. The tower cleared me onto the runway for takeoff. The brakes were on full as I throttled the engine to full power. My brain was fully engaged, checking gauges and instruments. But earlier you said that you had to learn to do this by instinct. So if your brain was fully engaged, well, you weren't using instinct, were you? Alright, whatever. I released the brakes and the airplane began rumbling down the center of the runway. I shifted the plane into afterburner, and with a loud bang, the acceleration intensified and the sudden increase from 10,000 to more than 16,000 pounds of thrust. The movement was amazing. I guided the airplane with my feet straight down the runway. At 110 knots, I pulled slightly back on the control and the aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground. I raised the landing gear, shut off the afterburner, and I was airborne. It was exciting the first time I flew, and it was exciting the last time. It didn't matter where you had been or where you were going. The only thing that mattered was the moment, getting that airplane off the ground. Cockpits of fighter jets are tiny and close, and they force you to learn economy of motion, which I guess explains why he did so well with the poncho at Trump's inauguration. They also force you to master yourself mentally, physically, and emotionally. You have to stay calm and think logically. One mistake, and you could end up in a very expensive metal coffin. Yeah, after 9/11, he remained calm and thought logically. So I'm glad that he learned that from his time in the Air National Guard. Several of my fellow pilots had participated in a program known as Palace Alert, which rotated Guard pilots into Vietnam to relieve active duty pilots. A friend and fellow pilot, another friend, Fred Bradley, and I were interested in participating, and we talked with Colonel Jerry Killian about it. He told us that the program was being phased out, that a few more pilots would go, but that Fred and I had not logged enough flight hours to participate. Bull to the shit. There is no way that George W. Bush tried to volunteer for active duty on the front lines of Vietnam. Not only that, but it's not the problem would not be that he had insufficient number of hours. The problem is clearly that he's flying a plane that cannot partake in the Vietnam War. You can't drop bombs from an F-102. You can't dogfight in an F-102. He would have to relearn something like the F-105 Thunder Chief or the F-4 Phantom if he wanted to participate. So that's the real problem. You can't just fly an F-102 and then strap into one of those. You'd need to be retrained, and some other stuff would have to go on. So there's no way that he's accurate about this problem. I continued flying with my unit for the next several years. This is something that many people would dispute. We developed a great sense of camaraderie and teamwork. My fellow pilots were interesting people, a mix of airline pilots, businessmen, and entrepreneurs. So the thing is, like, businessmen and entrepreneurs, couldn't you just say businessmen? Some people work for other people, some people work for themselves. I mean, that doesn't add much variety. You should just say airline pilots and businessmen. And that's not much of a mix. That's literally two types of people. Okay. We were different, but we worked well together. You weren't that different. You later went into business. You tried to be an entrepreneur. I mean, what are these great chasms of difference that you had to overcome here? The military is good at fostering loyalty and cooperation and strong morale. The most challenging moments were flying in formation within 3 to 5 feet of another jet fighter at a speed of 350 knots, more than 400 miles an hour. You had to learn to trust your fellow pilots. Sometimes we flew at night, and sometimes in very difficult weather. The mission of the Air National Guard at the time was to protect the American coast. We were trained to shoot down other airplanes. Thankfully, I never had a close call in the air. No shit, the war was in Vietnam, not in the United States. The only conceivable way that Bush would have seen action in this time would have been if Fidel Castro lost his mind and sent his Air Force to bomb Texas. And even then, I imagine that there were better interceptors that would be sent out from the Air Force rather than from the Air National Guard. Bush was only really doing this on weekends anyway. It doesn't make sense. He's making it out like there was a real chance that he would be called to do something in action, and that's just not the case. That's pure fantasy. I had a few tense moments, especially at night when we were flying in close formation in bad weather. Your head would tell you to go in one direction, the instruments another. It took all my training to fight my instincts and trust the instruments. We lost 2 men in our unit when I was flying. One pilot disappeared over the Gulf of Mexico. He was never found. Another crashed while flying a test flight for NASA. It brought a sobering reality to what we were doing. I served, and I am proud of my service. Yet, I know it was nothing comparable to what our soldiers and pilots were doing in battle in Vietnam. I lost several friends there, pilots I trained with in flight school. They are my heroes. Okay, so at least he does acknowledge that people who did real military service had it much worse. But he also admits here that people he went to flight school with were able to gain the necessary experience to then get into the war. And he claims that he wasn't able to pull that off. Why not? How did that work? How could you not get into the war when all of the people you went to flight school with had no problem getting into the war? You're well connected. You're a Bush. If you wanted in, you could easily get in. I'm going to have to call bullshit here. And it's bullshit that you yourself exposed. My time in the Guard taught me the importance of a well-trained and well-equipped military. It gave me respect for the chain of command. It showed me firsthand that given proper training and adequate personnel, the military can accomplish its mission. Just like the adequate supplies and armor that you gave the troops in Iraq, right? After all, the military took a novice like me and trained me to be a skilled pilot of high-performance jets. If you were skilled, you would have acquired more experience, and you would have been assigned to a more prestigious and useful aircraft than the F-102 Delta Dagger. Let's keep it real here. There's no way that if you were one of the top pilots, they would be like, yeah, here's an outdated interceptor. You can pretend to fly around Texas and defend us from UFOs. I also learned the lesson of Vietnam. Here we go. Our nation should be slow to engage troops, but when we do so, we must do so with ferocity. We must not go into a conflict unless we go in committed to win. We can never again ask the military to fight a political war. If America's strategic interests are at stake, if diplomacy fails, if no other option will accomplish the objective, the commander-in-chief must define the mission and allow the military to achieve it. You say you learned the lesson, but I lived through the early 2000s, and yeah, you didn't. You got us involved in two major wars that we're still in, where you never laid out a clear mission, and you did not necessarily always give the military the tools it needed to succeed. Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. The war in Iraq is very clearly a political war. The war in Afghanistan is also mostly a political war. We could have just gone in and gone after bin Laden and left. I don't think we actually had a responsibility to rebuild the country. The country had already been in shambles before we arrived. We didn't actually break anything. Anyway, yeah, so as you can tell, this book is full of all kinds of stunning insights from the former president, and I think we're going to have some fun with this one. So join me next time, and we will backtrack and look at Chapter 3.